Hello and welcome to On the Record, where we go behind the headlines for hard-hitting analysis with the experts. Why is it Jamaicans have succeeded so well in sprinting at the past two Olympics, with Russians dominating women's tennis and South Koreans excelling in women's golf? The reason is how talent is identified and developed, with success simply down to who wants it the most. Rasmus Ankersen is an ex-footballer. He's a speaker on performance development and is a trusted advisor to businesses and athletes around the world. He's written The Goldmine Effect, Crack the Secrets of High Performance. It's published by Icon. It's taken his exploration of the secrets of high performance a step further, becoming the only expert, no less, on the subject to have lived and trained with the best athletes on the planet. I caught up with Rasmus on his recent trip down under. Rasmus Ankersen, a warm welcome to you. Let's just begin understanding your own phenomenal success, which was dashed so unexpectedly, and how that has proved a driver and the context for everything you've subsequently written about.
Yeah, so, 7 years back, I still thought basically I was going to be a professional soccer player. Today I'm just here, injured and forgotten, and I became a coach instead. So I was building one of the first soccer academies in Scandinavia. And there was particularly one story from that kind of kicked off my goldmine expedition. And we recruited at that time a player. He was 15 years old. His name was Simon. We took him in because we basically couldn't get anyone better than him. And we ended up selling him 3 years later when he was 18 years old for £4 million. And today he's perceived as one of the greatest defense talents in the world. And the interesting part of that story was that my boss at that time, the academy director, when Simon and the other players were 15 years old, came into the coach's office one day and gave each of us a piece of paper asking us to write down the 5 players we think would be the best 5 years in the future. And we did that, and he puts all these pieces of paper into an envelope, and 5 years later, he reopened the envelope. And obviously, there was not a single one of us coaches who had Simon Kjær here on our list. Out of 16 players, we had to choose 5, and still not a single one had Simon Kjær among the 5. So obviously, every day ever since, I've asked myself, what did I overlook? And that kind of made me ask myself questions like, what is talent really? How is that identified in sports as well as in business? Where do we look for talent? Do we really know what we look for?
And on that score, just how important are the coaches and the mentors, if we're applying it in a business context? Crucially as well, alongside that, Rasmus, not necessarily being from the industry that they're then training. In other words, bringing outside skills to bear.
Yeah, so what I found in studying these gold mines of talent were that many of their godfathers, as I call them, the top coaches, were not former athletes themselves. So like this guy, Stephen Francis, who is the world's most successful sprint coach in Jamaica, he weighs 150 kilos, having never sprinted himself, graduated in statistics at the University of Michigan, and coming back to Jamaica and founded this track and field club. And he basically thinks about identifying people's potential as a private equity bank thinks about identifying potential companies.
It's really interesting, that private equity analogy, because you could say stripping it all down to basics is exactly what you've observed on the sports training front. So the idea of academy, well, that's kind of a name alone, is it not? We're talking a dusty pitch, 4 a.m. in the morning, no lighting, a gym that's rusting away, and you're arriving in that environment expecting to find what? I mean, you can't even see through the gloom, but they're already training.
Yeah. I still remember I came out there on the MVP track and field training ground 5:30 in the morning, and I looked around, and the first thing I thought was, where is the running track? Because all I saw was a big grass field. And I actually asked my taxi driver there to wait for 10 minutes because he obviously drove me to the wrong address. But then I realized I was exactly where I'm supposed to be, because we think the sprinters train in luxury fancy facilities, but they don't. They train on a diesel-scored grass track and in a rusty gym. So I think his point is that a performance environment should not be designed for comfort. It should be designed for hard work. So he keeps the facilities Spartan and simple to get the answer to the most important question, which is, who wants it most?
It's almost as if an athlete the calibre of Usain Bolt would not appeal to a lot of coaches, the ones that you're saying are great, because they've already arrived. They're more looking for that unseen potential, the momentum factor that will occur into the future, and perhaps also alongside that, the setbacks that someone's gone through to make them hungry enough to push on in spite of adversity.
Yeah, what he says is basically put hunger above skills. So when you have the necessary skills, the question stops being what can you do today, it becomes what can you learn tomorrow. So one example is Gillian Fraser, who just won the gold again a few weeks ago in London on the 100 meter. And she was actually a mediocre sprinter, running not that fast on the 100. She was quite fast on the first 70 meters, but broke down in the last 30 meters. And all athletic coaches would say she will never make it because she's not fast. But Stephen Francis thought, if I could give her some strengths on the last 30 meters, she could be very fast. So he doesn't look for what works only. He also looks for what's broken. And then he asks himself, can I fix this problem? And do I have time to fix it? And that's his way of spotting potential.
Let's talk about divine dissatisfaction, this idea that it's all very well and good to be hungry and never content with mediocrity, but when you may believe that it's time to break from one industry into another, and you're looking at a skills deficit potentially, those that have been in that new field and getting runs on the board for a lot longer than you, how do you bridge that divide between wanting the change but not having the perceived magic 10,000 hours of experience under your belt?
Well, the 10,000 hour rule is I think, symbolic in the sense that it shows that nothing comes easy. The researchers really concludes that nobody becomes an expert in his or her field, no matter what they do with less than 10,000 hours of practice. So transferring that into business, I think there's a lot of business leaders that would say, I mean, sports is different because in sports you practice 80% of the time and then you compete 20% of the time. And in business it's opposite. We compete 95% of the time and practice 5% of the time. But I don't think we have to agree about what practice means. And I think practice is what you do every day, not on a course on a spa hotel somewhere. It's a mindset you bring with you into what you do. There's a lot of studies actually showing from INSEAD in Paris that people in business tend to perform worse the more experience they get. And it sounds strange, how can you do that? But it's basically because they drive on automatic pilots. They don't think about how they can improve, they don't get feedback, they don't practice. And you don't improve if you don't practice.
And again, you're back on Bolt saying, look, how could that excellence have ever occurred through simply just one 45-minute feedback session in a year, typically what you might be expecting in the business world, in those professional spheres. So really, that's all too apparent with the Bolt example.
These gold mines are what I would call really feedback-rich environments. So in business, we often get a feedback session once a year. And I mean, imagine if Usain Bolt did a feedback session once a year, getting to know his time only once a year. That wouldn't work.
Back on that idea, though, of a lack of mentoring, a lack of inspiration in a current role, but being frustrated as well by how you transition, can you ever actually attain commensurate success in a fresh area when there is such a deficit maybe of applicable skills that you know you haven't got on the table?
Yeah, I think that's possible. I mean, I don't think this is about sports. I think the underlying principles applies quite well to business. It's a lot about building these factors that characterizes a gold mine into an environment instead of focus on individual characteristics. And that one factor might be that feedback. I think there is a competitive advantage just in doing that. Another competitive advantage might be found in identifying talent and getting the right people, understanding what you look for, all these kinds of things. Yeah.
Tell me about those perceived skill sets that are sitting on people's CVs, and when people are looking to fill roles, they habitually just default to those who have already occupied those roles in that known industry. But you would be saying, look, don't be so tunnel vision. Go outside that, go more broadly, and look at the success in other areas as maybe having more application than you think it might in the sector you're in.
Yeah, you can there was a good example actually in Australia a couple of years back where Australian Institute of Sports tried to transfer talent from one field to another. So they tried to take world-class gymnasts and made them world-class aerial skiers, and succeeding doing that because the critical competence is the same. I mean, you can always give people a pair of skis and teach them to go down the hill, but you cannot teach them feeling of space. That was the critical competence. So if you know what you really look for in business as well as in sports, you can find talent in places you never thought it existed. I was in Kuala Lumpur a few days ago actually, and doing some research on a guy who runs a service security business, who found his own gold mine in hiring taxi drivers. Because he thinks that the critical factor for a taxi driver is the same as if you're in a service security business. Once you master the mechanical skills driving the car, your success comes down to whether you are willing to go an extra mile for the customer. So he's hiring taxi drivers in KL because he thinks he can transfer that skill to his business. So talent is everywhere.
Tell me about the money motivator though, alongside often the paradox of that, where you've got athletes even in Africa who've done so well they could afford luxurious flats, but they've opted instead to live in relative abject poverty in that training kind of focused, channeled environment.
I met a marathon runner in Kenya, and she ran 200 miles a week to become good enough for 15 years to win a big marathon. And she won down in Rotterdam, and the day after she won, and it doesn't make you a millionaire, but you win quite a lot of money, Kenyan standards compared. The day after she wins, she quits. She hasn't gone for a jog the coming 15 years. So if money is the only motivator, your motivation is not sustainable. That's why you see in business that sometimes higher incentives can lead to worse performance over time. So you have to find something else. Want to master a skill, to keep developing, divine dissatisfaction, seeing a purpose with what you do, all these kinds of things.
And you would say, what, and all of that instrumental of the role of parents, it might seem to many that that's selfish, it's not letting them breathe and discover for themselves, but actually giving them that jump start enables them to maybe find the passion, eventually once they've had all of that head start.
I think that it's not always passion that builds persistence. Very often it's persistence that builds passion. So somebody pushing you to do something can be good if it's done the right way. Because once you master a skill, once you challenge yourself, once you get the recognition, you will start developing the passion. Passion is grown, I think. You're not born with that.
Rasmus, you've been here long enough to pick up on the psyche of Australians, one well suspects. Are we too complacent for our own good? Does it occur to you? Or even as one CEO just said to me recently, are we the most unhappy, albeit successful nation in the world?
Yeah, well, I wrote a chapter because I'm from Denmark, we have kind of the same situation. I wrote a chapter to the Danish Prime Minister's book last year, and I called my chapter, How Do You Create Hunger in Paradise? And I think this is the same question to be asked here. So when we have a very comfortable way of living, where should that hunger come from? And I don't really have the recipe for that, but I think it's an interesting question to put on.
Would there be anything, though, as a starting point you might identify perhaps on the road to achieving that?
Obviously, I think understanding the anatomy of passion is one step, because if you can ignite people, I think they'll be willing to practice the 10,000 hours, and that's where it should start.
There's a lesson there for all of us. All right, Rasmus, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks indeed.
Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Good luck.